Chapter 30. Gathering Shing. The war party assembled and supplies were loaded. Those not quick would be left behind. Darius made this clear. Their employers would not like that. They were to be part of a seized glory. Making quick work, they loaded up until nightfall. Darius made certain to leave extra room for supplies and potential victims. Carts, as far as costs were concerned, were fairly cheap. Boxes were loaded, and the majority of those gathered were veterans of battle, at the least extremely skilled and well-provisioned ones. The house's personal guards and the ones from those houses who only offered relatively few in number made up for it in other skills. They had war mages, scryers, and skilled shots. Those skilled with blades knew technique and how to set traps. They had medicines ready of magical and chemical natures. Sophisticated crossbows were ready, and arrows, no doubt dipped in paralytic venom or other unpleasant things for witches. They were not there to bargain, and the witches would know it. Some already were resting in the carts by the time the horses and beasts made their way across the road. The carts were as comfortable as they would get for some time. Darius's cart held representatives of the houses. They at least did him the favor of not giving tactical advice. He asked basic questions about witches, and for a rundown of how their magic worked and who were their enemies. He looked over the map, despite being familiar with the area. He ordered some of the learned men to instruct various commanders on a few points. They all need to have a basic understanding of witches. The simplest truth was this: never bargain with witches. Never let them have your true name or blood. Do not give them the opportunities to speak when they die. Darius asked questions on where wards could be placed. Not for himself, but rather for creative places where witches might place them. The experts bickered on smaller details, but he got the idea. Some witches would go as far as to place magic on the very air itself. It simply depended on the ward and the purpose of it. He talked about ways to dispel those who might be enthralled. Those who could dispel magic could free animals or men bewitched. Rather than focus on saving everyone, he simply checked on where prisoners might be and the range of those skilled with dispelling magic. The witches could control men as well, called enthralled. Ideally, they could kill the witch and let the enthralled gain their freedom. He made it clear killing them was not against orders, but if convenient, save them. Witches might force them to kill enthralled, and it was important they know what situations they couldn't be saved. The horses held a steady but not too quick pace. Those with birds scouted ahead. Darius supposed the first target would be the town, but then he thought better of it. If there was a way to open communications with the witchblades and get the locations of the witches, it might be smarter to begin the process of removing their defenses. In that respect, Darius had a secret weapon: nephelite. Of course, he would only give such weapons to those he felt confident would return them. He chuckled as some of the mages attempted to identify it using magical means. Although he needed to make examples of a few men who tried using magic on the blades a little too openly. His own armor had a coat of nephelite and other metals on top. Those with magic found it difficult to look into his mind or scry through him. In addition, those swords he passed out to his own personal unit seemed to be of the same make. No doubt they whispered amongst themselves. Talk of Darius's secret weapons grew. He had no intention of sharing them. In fact, selling them would be out of the question for a time. He intended to do so, of course, but they needed to be perfected and he couldn't risk them being studied. Fortunately, if they were stolen, they were remarkably easy to track. Attempts were made to contact the witchblades. However, it seemed that from the birds and reports from scryers that the town was mostly empty now. There seemed to be skeletons and witch-spawn corpses washed up beside the river downstream from the town. But the little lumber town was abandoned. Darius had no intention of stopping in that town. Instead, he considered where witches might be. Ultimately, he needed a witchblade to voice more sound theory than his. He might know ideal places to set up camp or vantage points, but he did not know witches. He did, however, know something at least. The witches' camp would need space. It was a large coven they were hunting, and as such, they would need places to keep prisoners, and no doubt they'd have fires. Places to cook food, perhaps. Or perhaps they ate raw food. Even so, he commanded those with birds to look out for fires in the deep wood. There might be smoke or some sign of spellcraft smoke. The birds of course would have to keep a distance, but those who spoke to them suggested a place. Scryers and the magus were coming up with a very few ideas about where the witches might be. It seemed that using things like birds was far more effective than trying to see them with magic. Even familiars or spiritual spies were going to be useless for finding the witches. The defenses the witches prepared were built more for other witches rather than those with eyes. They tended to lack practical things like hiding a fire or well. It was clear what was needed. Excess wagons and supplies should be sent to town along with a small portion of the forces. Should any adventurers join them, so be it. But the true force would go into the woods and make play of the witches' wards. Break a single ward, and the witches would no doubt gather and try to defend it. Break them from all sides, and they'd have confusion. Witches were not a military force. No doubt they wouldn't respond with the organization necessary. But they did have minions. Although he supposed they would have been thinned, Meredith was still out there somewhere, and the company must be someplace safe. As much as he'd like to look for them, it'd be better to begin weakening the witches at once, striking while they were getting ready. Darius sighed and had an assignment ready for Scipio. "Can you find Meredith? He's alive most likely and in hiding. Bring him to the main forces and see if the witchblades are with him. We can use their assistance for the assault." One of the advisors made a fair suggestion. "Perhaps we should hold off the assault until such time as we have the witchblades." Darius would have agreed, except the timing was too perfect to strike. Their guard is most certainly down, and once they know we're here in full force, they'll prepare. Even a small host of strike teams now could do damage which we could not do later. We'll no doubt need them for the final assault, but we need to make ready. Augustana, will you lead one of the teams? She would, of course. "As always, I'll be your sword." Scipio agreed. "I stand ready. I'll be able to find Meredith. Guessing from what I've heard about the area, he might have crossed the river, considering the dead washed up on the edges of the river. I have heard the witch's magic is weakened past the river as well." It was a damned good guess, Darius agreed. "I'll lead a host of men on the east front. Augustana and I will flank them. If any progress can be easily made in the south, make it. But all you need do is make an appearance and ready the mass forces. If they strike, hold your ground. It took over 20 years to make that small lumber town. We'll not hand it over so easily. We need a base of operations. Purge it of traps and ready the defense. This will most certainly draw their attention." Actually, the magus saw his reasoning. If we gather in town en masse, they probably wouldn't assume that we were striking them from two places with a strike force. Witches expect mortals to strike with great numbers to ensure victory. It was simple. Even overthinking it led to the same conclusion. "Do it," Darius said. For the final assault, they no doubt would need the sound advice of witchblades. But for now they separated a small force on the roads, and the majority went to the towns south of the Coven, and the others would travel slowly through the woods, removing wards and defenses. If things went sour, they would simply regroup in town. Scipio took his own horse with a few riders trailing behind. Augustana split to her own cart of men and followed Darius. The witches likely expected something, but they were not ready for this. They were not going to be prepared for a force with anti-magic weapons given to the elite. They were not going to expect this many this soon. Nor would they expect a relatively well-equipped elite force made up from the houses of Shing, rather than a strictly military or hired force. No, Darius Urn had the full intention to call them.